How South Africa made poverty payable, but not escapable. The 26.5 million social grant audit. Chapter 1. The number South Africa cannot ignore. 26.5 million people. That is the number South Africa cannot ignore, not as a campaign slogan, not as a social media insult, not as a lazy argument about poor people. 26.5 million social grant beneficiaries. Let us be fair, South Africa is not the only country that pays social support. Modern states do this. The United States has food stamps. Britain has welfare support. Canada has income supports. Many European countries have child benefits, unemployment support, pensions, disability support, housing support, and other forms of social protection. So the audit is not saying South Africa is wrong because it pays grants. That would be weak analysis. The serious question is scale. How many people depend on the support? Why do they depend on it? Is the support protecting vulnerability, or is it replacing wages that the economy is no longer creating? That is where the comparison becomes important. In the United States, food stamps support tens of millions of people. According to United States Department of Agriculture linked data, summarized by USA Facts, an average of about 42.1 million people received food assistance every month in fiscal year 2025, equal to about 12.3% of the United States population. The United States Census Bureau estimated the United States population at 341.8 million in July 2025. So yes, America pays food assistance to millions of people, but it does not pay that support to nearly half the country. Now bring the comparison back to South Africa. Statistics. South Africa estimated South Africa's mid-year population at about 63.1 million people in 2025. When South Africa's budget says social grants will support 26.5 million beneficiaries, the issue is no longer simply that grants exist. The issue is that grant dependency has become a large share of the national household survival model. That is the audit. Not grants versus no grants. Not compassion versus cruelty. Scale dependency. Work, wages, and mobility. This is an audit. The numbers matter, the structure matters. No slogans. No contempt for poor households. No toy-toying. We are going to follow the grant, the household, the labor market, the taxpayer, and the state system that now carries survival for millions of people. In South Africa's 2026 budget speech, the government said social grants would support 26.5 million beneficiaries in the 2026 to 2027 financial year. The same budget allocated 292.8 billion rand to social. Grants.government also said total consolidated spending would be 2.67 trillion rand. That is not a small welfare line. That is a national operating signal. And this episode must begin with absolute clarity. This is not an audit of poor people. This is not an attack on children receiving support. This is not an attack on pensioners in Limpopo, grandmothers in the Eastern Cape, disabled people in KwaZulu-Natal, unemployed young people in Gauteng, or households in the Free State trying to survive one more month. This is not a story about laziness. This is not a story about handouts. This is not a story about people choosing grants instead of work. Many able-bodied South Africans did not choose. The grant system has a life plan. The economy excluded them. The labor market locked them out. The local factory closed. The mine retrenched. The municipality failed. The township business never received financing. The rural school did not convert education into mobility. The bus fare to the industrial area became too expensive. The young person finished school, sent applications, borrowed data, walked to interviews, and still found the door closed. So the audit question is not, why are poor people receiving grants? That is too small. The real question is sharper. What does it mean when one of Africa's largest and most sophisticated economies needs grants at this scale to keep the country socially functional? South Africa has banks, mines, ports, universities, airports, supermarkets, malls, tourism hubs, industrial zones, farms, call centers, logistics companies, and financial institutions. And yet, month after month, millions of households depend on state transfers to keep food in the house. That is the contradiction. If you are a worker supporting relatives, this audit explains why your salary often does not feel like your salary alone. If you are a grant recipient, this audit explains why the grant helps but does not free the household. If you are a young person looking for work, this audit explains why the problem is not only effort, it is the structure around work. If you are a taxpayer, this audit explains why the productive base matters. And if you are a policymaker, this audit explains why paying the grant is not the same as building mobility. A grant can keep a household alive. It cannot replace an economy that creates work. That is the 26.5 million beneficiary audit. When a safety net becomes this large, it is no longer only catching people when they fall, it is holding up part of the national floor. And when a national floor has to be held up every month, the country must ask a harder question. Is South Africa using grants to protect vulnerable people? Or is South Africa using grants to compensate for an economy that no longer absorbs enough of its own citizens? That is where this audit begins, not with contempt, with respect, not with slogans, with evidence, because the grant is not the disease, the grant is the evidence. Chapter 2. What the grant system actually does to audit the grant economy. Honestly, we first have to say what grants actually do. They prevent suffering. They keep children eating. They support elderly households. They protect disabled people. They stabilize families where wages have disappeared, never arrived, or are spread too thin. According to South Africa's 2026 budget speech, the Old Age Grant, Disability Grant, and Care Dependency Grant were set to rise to 2,400 rand per month. The Child Support Grant and Grant in Aid were set at 580 rand. The Foster Care Grant increased to 1,290 rand in April and 1,300 rand in October. Those amounts are not abstract. They move through real households. They buy maize meal, cooking oil, school shoes, electricity, transport, medicine, airtime, and debt repayment. They support grandparents in Guyana, children in Mathatha, unemployed adults in Tembisa, caregivers in Umlazi, and rural households in Lusikisiki. A pensioner in Limpopo does not experience 2,400 rand as a policy category. She experiences it as the monthly calculation between food, electricity, clinic transport, school needs for grandchildren, funeral contributions, and someone in the family asking for help. A mother in Khayelitsha does not experience 580 rand as an academic debate about redistribution. She experiences it as part of the food plan, the school plan, the transport plan, and the survival plan. An unemployed young person in Orange Farm does not experience the Social Relief of Distress Grant as a luxury. The Social Relief of Distress Grant remained at 370 rand per month, with payments continuing into the 2026 to 2027 year. 370 rand does not create a life. But in a cash-starved household, it can buy data, help with transport, support food, or keep a person connected to the job search economy. This is why the audit must not flatten grant recipients into one category. A pensioner is not the same as an unemployed graduate. A child is not the same as an able-bodied adult locked out of work. A disabled person is not the same as a young man in a township who wants work but cannot find it. A rural grandmother caring for grandchildren in the Eastern Cape is not the same as a job seeker in Johannesburg sleeping in a back room while searching for peace jobs. The grant system touches different lives for different reasons. That is why crude. Attacks on grant people are analytically useless. They do not explain the system, they do not explain the economy, they do not explain why South Africa's household survival model has become so dependent on monthly transfers. Without grants, South Africa would be harsher, hungrier, and more unstable. Many households would collapse faster, many children would miss more school, many elderly people would lose their remaining dignity, many unemployed adults would fall deeper into desperation. So the question is not whether grants matter. They matter. The question is what grants are now being asked to carry. If a grant helps an elderly woman buy food in rural Limpopo, that is social protection. If that same grant is also feeding her unemployed adult child and 3 grandchildren, because no one else in the household has work, then the grant has become something else. It has become a household wage substitute. That is the audit. The grant is doing its job, but it is also doing the economy's job, and that is not sustainable as a national operating model. Chapter 3. The survival floor is not a mobility platform. A safety net catches people when they fall. A mobility platform helps people climb. South Africa has built the first one far better than the second. That is the central distinction in this episode. The Kopje Journal and Review defines a survival floor as support that prevents immediate collapse without necessarily creating upward movement. That is what grants are doing here. They are keeping the floor from breaking, but a floor is not a ladder. A floor stops the fall. A ladder changes the position. This is where South Africa's contradiction becomes visible. The old age grant may be 2,400 rand. The child support grant may be 580 rand. The social relief of distress grant may be 370 rand. But those amounts enter households where the real cost of survival can be much higher. According to the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Household Food Basket Report, for March 2026, the household food basket was reported at 5,328 rand and 53 cents. The same March report placed 30 kilograms of maize meal at 305 rand and 7 cents. That is the difference between a floor and a platform. The grant helps, but it does not complete the household economy. A child support grant may help a child eat before school, but it does not guarantee that the school has strong teaching, safe classrooms, working toilets, functioning transport, and a real pathway from grade 12 into training, employment, or enterprise. An old age grant may stabilize a household in Venda, Butterworth, or Nongoma, but it does not create a job for the unemployed adult child sitting at home. A social relief of distress payment may help a young person buy data in Soweto, Delft, or KwaMashu, but data alone does not create vacancies. A disability grant may support dignity, but it does not fix inaccessible transport, weak inclusion systems, or local economies that cannot absorb disabled workers into meaningful opportunity. A grant may help with food, electricity, transport, school shoes, medicine, debt repayment, and emergency pressure. But by itself, it does not rebuild the missing mobility architecture around the household. That architecture includes functioning schools, affordable transport, safe communities, local business financing, reliable municipal services, entry-level jobs, apprenticeships, industrial growth, township supplier development, rural enterprise, and a credible path from learning to earning. When those systems are weak, the grant becomes a holding pattern. The household survives January. Then February comes. Then March comes. Then winter comes. The same pressures return through school costs, rent, food, electricity, transport, funerals, debt, and clinic visits. The month survives, but the year does not transform. That is the survival floor danger. Redistribution reduces pain, but without production, work, and mobility, redistribution becomes managed dependency. Not because recipients are morally weak, not because households are lazy, because the system around the grant does not create enough upward movement. This is why the grant system can be both necessary and dangerous. Necessary, because without it, poverty would deepen. Dangerous, because if it becomes the substitute for work, then the country has not solved poverty. It has made poverty administratively manageable. South Africa can process the payment. It can update the beneficiary list. It can announce the increase. It can manage the queue. It can budget the transfer. But the deeper question remains unresolved. Where is the ladder? Where is the pathway from support into work? Where is the conversion from survival into security? Where is the route from household consumption into household assets? Where is the bridge from a grant-supported child to a working adult? The grant keeps the floor from breaking. But if the floor is all the country builds, the child grows up on the floor. That is the structural danger. Chapter 4. When work stops absorbing. People South Africa's social grant system is large because the labour market is not absorbing enough people. That is the pivot. According to Statistics South Africa's quarterly labour force figures, the official unemployment rate was 32.9% in the first quarter of 2025. The expanded unemployment rate was 43.1%. By the fourth quarter of 2025, the official unemployment rate had declined to 31.4%. The broader combined rate of unemployment and potential labour force stood at 42.1%. Whether the official number is 32.9% in one quarter or 31.4% in another, the structural picture does not change. South Africa is running a mass exclusion labour market. That is the engine behind grant dependency, and this is where the audit must go harder. The Kopje Journal and Review views it as insufficient analysis to blame the person standing outside the labour market without auditing the gate that keeps that person outside. Do not blame the person standing outside the gate. Audit the gate. In Johannesburg, a young man in Diepsloot can wake up before sunrise, try to get toward Midrand or Fourways, look for warehouse work, return with nothing, and still be told by online commentators that he prefers a grant. The geography itself carries cost. The road distance between Midrand and Diepsloot is about 20 kilometers. A ride-hailing or private taxi estimate for that short distance can easily run into the hundreds of rand, depending on time, traffic, and availability. A minibus route may be far cheaper, but it can add waiting time, transfers, uncertainty, safety exposure, and fatigue before the job seeker has earned even 1 rand. That is the lived economy of job seeking. A person can be close to work on a map and still far from work in cash terms. In the Eastern Cape, a young woman in Mathatha can complete school, try to enter college, fail to access funding, return home, help care for siblings, and still be treated as if her unemployment is a personal lifestyle choice. In KwaZulu-Natal, a mother in Umlazi can want work, but childcare, transport costs, weak local hiring, and safety risks can turn a job search into a financial gamble. In the northwest, a former mine worker near Rustenburg can be retrenched, age out of easy re-entry, and find that the household now depends on a pensioner, a grant, informal work, and debt. In the Free State, a young person in Botshabelo can live close enough to an economy to see it, but far enough from opportunity to be excluded from it. This is the South African contradiction. The economy is visible. The malls, banks, roads, office parks, mines, airports, universities, and logistics corridors are visible. But visibility is not access. A country can have sophisticated economic assets and still exclude millions from the wage system. That is South Africa's problem. It is not only poverty, it is exclusion from production. The formal economy is too narrow. Entry-level hiring is too weak. Small businesses face too many barriers. Township economies circulate cash but do not always build productive ownership. Rural areas carry households but do not generate enough income. Transport costs punish job seekers before they even earn wages. Education produces many young people who are technically qualified for hope but not absorbed into work. This is why the beneficiary number matters. 26.5 million beneficiaries is not simply proof of state generosity, it is evidence of labour market failure. If enough people were being absorbed into work, household dependency would gradually fall. If entry-level jobs were expanding, the social relief of distress grant would not carry the same political pressure. If township enterprises were scaling, more cash would stay local and turn into employment. If rural production were stronger, fewer households would depend on one pensioner's grant. If municipalities worked, small businesses would face fewer daily operational shocks. But when growth is weak, jobs are scarce, transport is expensive, schools are uneven, municipalities fail, and businesses do not absorb labour at scale, the grant becomes the shock absorber. The person receives the grant, but the system created the dependency. The grant recipient did not design the economy. The grant recipient did not create a 31 to 33% official unemployment rate. The grant recipient did not collapse the factory. The grant recipient did not break the municipality. The grant recipient did not design spatial apartheid. The grant recipient did not make transport unaffordable. The grant recipient did not decide that one working relative should support 6 people. The grant recipient is living inside the structure. The audit must name the structure. South Africa is not running a welfare problem only. It is running a work problem, a household income problem, and a mobility problem. Chapter 5. The household economy. One grant, many mouths. A grant may be paid to one person, but it rarely lives alone. Inside the household, money pools, stretches, disappears, and carries emotional weight. It decides who eats first, who travels, who stays home, who buys medicine, who delays debt, who misses school, and who pretends not to need anything. This is where the grant economy becomes visible. Picture a grandmother in rural Lusikisiki in the Eastern Cape. Her old age grant arrives at 2,400 rand. On paper, it is hers. In the household, it belongs to the survival plan. There is maize meal to buy. According to the March 2026 Household Food Basket Report, 30 kilograms of maize meal was reported at about 305 rand. There is also cooking oil, electricity, a clinic trip, a grandchild who needs school shoes, an unemployed adult child who has been looking for work in Mathatha, and a funeral contribution somewhere in the extended family. By the time the grant has done its work, the money has already carried more people than the policy category suggests. Now picture a mother in Khayelitsha. She receives child support, the child is the legal beneficiary. But the household does not eat in legal categories. Food is cooked in one pot. Electricity powers one room. Transport decisions affect everyone. If she receives 580 rand for a child and the household food basket is above 5,300 rand, the arithmetic speaks before the ideology begins. The grant helps, but it does not remove the dependency pressure. Now picture an unemployed young man in Orange Farm receiving social relief of distress support. He is able-bodied. He wants work. He does not want to stand in a queue forever. He does not want to be reduced to a stereotype. He wants a wage, a routine, a payslip, a sense of dignity, the ability to help at home, and the ability to plan beyond Friday. But the grant may be the only predictable cash that reaches him, so he uses it for data, transport, food, and avoiding complete disconnection. The XT grant is small, but the absence of it is large. Now picture a household in Tembisa. One person has work. 2 adults do not. 1 child receives support. An elderly relative receives a pension. The household must cover rent, food, school needs, transport, airtime, debt, electricity, and a funeral policy because death is also part of the household budget. The working person is not only a worker, he is a private welfare state. The pensioner is not only a pensioner, she is a household income spine. The grant is not only a grant, it is part of the monthly operating model. This is what national debates often miss. They discuss grants as if the recipient is isolated. But poverty is organized by households. Dependency is shared, survival is pooled. One grant can carry many mouths, one wage can carry many unemployed relatives. One missed payment can destabilize the entire home. This is why grants are politically sensitive, not because poor people are irrational, because households know what that money does. They know the cupboard, the taxi rank, the school uniform shop, the electricity meter, the funeral policy, the debt collector, and the month-end panic, but they also know the limitation. The grant helps the month survive. It does not automatically change the year, and if the year does not change, the child grows up inside the same household pressure. The young adult remains outside the labor market. The pension becomes the household wage. The grant becomes the rhythm of survival. That is the household economy behind the national number. 26.5 million beneficiaries is not just a statistic. It is millions of monthly negotiations inside kitchens, shacks, back rooms, reconstruction and development program houses, rural homesteads, township yards, and informal settlements across South Africa. Chapter 6. The political economy of monthly dependency. Now we move from the household to the state, because when millions of people depend on grants, grants stop being only social policy, they become political economy. This must be handled carefully. The easy argument is to say grants are just vote buying. That is too crude. It is too lazy. It does not explain enough. The stronger audit is this. When grants become socially essential, every government must protect them, every budget must account for them, every political party must speak to them, every fiscal adjustment must consider them, and every payment disruption becomes a national risk. That is not just welfare, that is political economy. According to the 2026 budget speech, social grants were allocated 292.8 billion rand for 2026 to 2027. Total consolidated government spending was set at 2.67 trillion rand. The same budget said the social wage accounted for more than 60% of non-interest spending over the medium term. That tells us something critical. The grant system is not peripheral. It sits inside the core fiscal architecture of the state. South Africa's state is carrying a survival floor for millions of households while also trying to fund schools, hospitals, police, debt service, infrastructure, public wages, municipalities, courts, roads, border control, and economic development. That is a heavy balance sheet. Now look at who benefits. The first beneficiary is the household, because the grant prevents immediate collapse. The second beneficiary is the state, because grants reduce social instability when the labor market fails. The third beneficiary is the retail and consumption chain, because grant money moves quickly into supermarkets, transport, airtime, electricity, debt repayment, and funeral policies. The fourth beneficiary is the political system, because the monthly payment becomes a stabilizing promise. That does not mean grants are cynical. It means grants sit inside a political economy. They stabilize households, they stabilize markets, they stabilize the state, but they also expose what the economy is not doing. The risk is not that grants exist. The risk is that grants expand their social role while growth remains too weak. National Treasury projected real gross domestic product growth of 1.5% in 2026, 1.8% in 2027, and 2% in 2028. That is growth. But it is not the kind of growth shock that automatically absorbs millions of excluded workers. A country can fund grants from growth, or a country can fund grants while growth remains weak. Those are not the same thing. If growth is strong, employment expands, firms hire, tax revenue broadens, and grants protect those who truly need support. In that model, the social wage is supported by productive expansion, But if growth is weak, unemployment remains high, the tax base is narrow, municipalities fail, debt service rises, and millions remain outside work, then the social wage becomes harder to sustain. Not morally harder, fiscally harder, politically harder, administratively harder. That is the pressure point. The government can announce the grant. The Treasury can allocate the money. The agency can process the payment. The recipient can collect the cash. The supermarket can receive the spending. The taxi can receive the fare. The electricity vendor can receive the token purchase. The funeral insurer can receive the debit order. But what happens next? Does the money build productive capacity? Does it expand local enterprise? Does it reduce long-term dependency? Does it create a stronger household balance sheet? Does it connect young people to work? Does it turn survival into mobility? Or does it move through the household, exit quickly into consumption chains, and return the family to the same point next month? This is where South Africa's political economy becomes uncomfortable. The grant system is successful at reaching households, but the economy is failing to graduate enough households out of dependency. That creates a permanent tension. The state cannot remove the floor, the people need the floor, but the country cannot confuse maintaining the floor with building it. The future. If the political system celebrates distribution but tolerates unemployment at this scale, it is not solving the structural crisis, it is managing the consequences. If the budget protects grants but the economy cannot produce enough work, the country is not building a mobility model, it is building a survival administration. That is why 26.5 million to beneficiaries is such a serious number. It tells us the state is present in household survival, but it also tells us the economy is absent from too many household futures. Chapter 7. The Taxpayer and Worker Pressure. Point: this chapter must not pit taxpayers against grant recipients. That is a false fight. The worker and the grant recipient are often in the same family. The taxpayer may be supporting unemployed relatives. The grant recipient may be caring for the taxpayer's child. The pensioner may be stabilizing a household that includes a working adult. The unemployed young person may be one job away from becoming a taxpayer. So the issue is not taxpayers versus the poor. The issue is whether the productive base is broad enough to sustain the social model. That is the balance sheet question. South Africa's social wage is large because the need is large, but the productive base must also grow. According to the 2026 budget figures, government allocated 527.2 billion rand to learning and culture. It allocated 310.4 billion rand to health. It allocated 446.6 billion rand to social development. It allocated 274.6 billion rand to peace and security. It allocated 432.4 billion rand to debt service costs. Those numbers show the crowding problem. The state must fund grants, but it must also fund education, health, policing, infrastructure, debt service, public wages, municipal support, courts, roads, border control, and economic development. The revenue side depends on production. It depends on work, firms, wages, profits, functioning cities, logistics, electricity, ports, rail, business confidence, and households that can move from survival into taxable economic participation. That is why unemployment is not only a labor issue. It is a fiscal issue, it is a social stability issue, it is a household dignity issue, it is a national operating issue. The debt burden makes the pressure even clearer. National Treasury projected gross loan debt at 6.326 trillion rand in 2026 to 2027. Debt service costs were projected at 432.4 billion rand for the same year. That means the state is paying more in debt service costs than it allocates to social grants. This is the harder fiscal truth. The country needs grants because household distress is real, but it also needs revenue, investment, growth, and jobs because the social model cannot be carried forever by a narrow, productive base. When the employment base is too narrow, every worker carries more pressure. A nurse in Durban may support children, siblings, parents, and unemployed relatives. A security guard in Pretoria may be earning a wage but still living inside poverty because the household claims are too many. A teacher in Polokwane may have a salary but no real surplus because extended family obligations absorb the income. A mine worker near Rustenburg may be counted as employed, but his wage may support a rural household, a township room, school costs, transport, and debt. This is South Africa's hidden welfare system. It is not only the state paying grants, it is also one employed person supporting many people who cannot find work. So the national model has two pressure points. The public grant system and the private family support system are both carrying what the labour market has failed to absorb. This is why the grant economy is not just about government payments. It is about the whole household income architecture. The formal worker is under pressure. The grant recipient is under pressure. The unemployed adult is under pressure. The pensioner is under pressure. The child is growing up inside pressure. The state is under pressure. And the economy is not producing enough relief. That is the strategic problem. A country cannot build long-term stability by stretching the same narrow productive base over a widening field of dependency. At some point, the productive base must expand. More people must work. More firms must grow. More townships must produce. More rural economies must earn. More young people must enter pathways. More households must build assets. Otherwise, the fiscal model becomes a monthly rescue operation. Necessary, but not transformational. The price of ignoring this is not only another budget cycle, it is another generation growing up with a grant in the house, but no ladder into work, assets, bargaining power, or independence. That is the intergenerational danger. Chapter 8. The Grant Economy. Around the grant now follow the money. Because the grant does not stop when it reaches the recipient. It moves. On payment days, the grant becomes cash circulation. It moves through supermarkets, spaza shops, taxi ranks, school uniform shops, electricity vendors, airtime sellers, funeral insurers, loan repayment systems, food wholesalers, informal traders, national retail chains, and transport networks. This is why the phrase grant economy must be understood carefully. The grant is not dead money. It circulates. It supports demand. It keeps small transactions alive. It helps township and rural economies move. At a national level, that circulation begins from a large fiscal platform, 292.8 billion rand allocated to social grants, reaching 26.5 million beneficiaries. At the household level, that same system may appear as 580 rand for a child, 370 rand for social relief of distress, or 2,400 rand for an older person, disability beneficiary, or care dependency beneficiary. Those numbers enter the street economy. A grandmother's pension in Thohoyandou may become groceries from a local shop. A child support grant in Mitchell's Plain may become school shoes, bread, and transport. A social relief of distress payment in Katlehong may become data, vetcoec, taxi fare, and a job search trip. A disability grant in Pietermaritzburg may become medication, food, and debt repayment. This money has economic life. But the audit question is sharper. Who captures the circulation? Does the money build household assets? Does it strengthen local production? Does it help township suppliers grow? Does it create employment inside poor communities? Does it support black-owned wholesalers and manufacturers? Does it help local food producers? Does it turn into savings, tools, training, stock, equipment, or small enterprise? Or does it pass quickly through poor households and flow outward into large retailers, transport costs, debt repayment, airtime, electricity, and consumption chains controlled elsewhere? That is the capture question. In many communities, the grant arrives locally but does not stay locally in productive form. The household receives the money. The household spends the money leaves. The household waits again. This is not because the household is foolish. It is because poverty is expensive. Food, transport, electricity, schooling, debt, funerals, data, and job searching all have transaction costs. Even survival has transaction costs. That is why the grant economy can create activity without creating mobility. The taxi rank can be busy. The supermarket can be busy. The pay point can be busy. The spaza shop can be busy. The queue can be busy. But activity is not the same as transformation. A community can have money moving through it without owning the productive systems that capture that money. If child support money buys bread from a national chain, the household survives. But if local bakeries, township suppliers, millers, delivery services, and school feeding procurement are connected, the same spending begins to support local production. That is the difference between consumption circulation and mobility circulation. That is the deeper audit. If the grant flows into food but the community does not produce food, the value leaves. If the grant flows into transport but the worker still cannot reach stable employment, the value leaks. If the grant flows into debt, the household is stabilizing yesterday's pressure instead of building tomorrow's asset. If the grant flows into large retailers but local suppliers remain weak, the township becomes a consumption site, not a production base. This is why grants alone cannot build a mobility economy. They create demand, but demand must be connected to local production, skills, enterprise, procurement, and ownership. Otherwise, the grant becomes a monthly injection into a leaking bucket. It helps the household survive. It helps the market transact. It helps the state prevent collapse, but it does not automatically build a stronger household balance sheet. This is the missing conversion. South Africa does not only need to ask how much money reaches poor households, it must ask what happens after the money arrives. Does it circulate in a way that builds community capacity, or does it simply confirm that poor households are consumers in an economy they do not control? The grant is social protection. The grant is also market demand. But if the productive base around the recipient is weak, the grant passes through poverty without defeating it. Chapter 9. The government cannot confuse payment. With transformation, now let us speak directly to the government, not as enemies of social grants, not as people who do not understand poverty, not as people who want children hungry, pensioners abandoned, disabled people humiliated, caregivers ignored, or unemployed young people thrown away. No, the message is this: yes to grants, but no to confusing grant payment with economic transformation. Government cannot sleep peacefully while official unemployment remains around 31 to 33%, broader labour market exclusion remains above 40%, and 26.5 million people depend on grants to stabilise household survival. Government cannot sleep peacefully while 292.8 billion rand must be allocated to social grants because household distress is now part of the operating model. Government cannot sleep peacefully while millions of young people wake up with no wage path. It cannot sleep peacefully while a grandmother's pension becomes the household's main income strategy. It cannot sleep peacefully while the child support grant is asked to do the work of schools, jobs, transport, and family income. And it cannot sleep peacefully because the payment system worked. The payment system working is not the same as the country working. A grant paid on time is important. But a grant paid on time to a household with no worker, no ladder, no enterprise route, no safe transport, no municipal reliability, and no youth pathway is still a survival system. It is not a mobility system. Government must not confuse administrative delivery with economic transformation. Paying the grant is the floor. It is not the mission completed. The mission is to build ladders from the floor. That means social protection must be connected to work, skills, enterprise, childcare, transport, local procurement, and household asset formation. The question is not how to remove the floor. The question is how to build ladders from the floor. A serious mobility model would protect the old age grant, the disability grant, the child support grant, foster care support, care dependency support, and emergency relief for those who need it. But it would also build stronger bridges around working-age people. It would connect unemployed youth in Soweto, Mdantsane, Umlazi, Khayelitsha, Botshabelo, Atteridgeville, Seshego, and Orange Farm to real work seeker support. It would not only tell them to apply online, it would help them cross the distance between where they live and where opportunity sits. It would treat transport as part of employment policy. It would treat childcare as part of women's economic participation. It would treat township supplier development as industrial policy, not charity. It would treat municipal service restoration as job creation infrastructure. It would treat apprenticeships as national survival infrastructure. It would treat public employment pathways as bridges, not permanent holding pens. It would connect school leavers to work experience before they become permanently discouraged. It would support small enterprises with procurement access, compliance onboarding, payment discipline, and local market integration. It would ask which grant-supported households have a working-age adult who wants training, placement, enterprise support, or digital job matching. It would segment recipients, not flatten them, because grant recipients are not a monolith. A pensioner needs dignity and protection. A disabled person may need income support, accessibility, and inclusion. A child needs food, schooling, safety, and a future. A caregiver needs support, childcare, and economic options. An unemployed young adult needs a pathway to work. An informal trader needs stock, safety, services, and market access. A rural household may need transport, agricultural support, connectivity, and local enterprise. A township household may need security, affordable commuting, business infrastructure, and reliable municipal services. Different people need different ladders, so do not govern them as one mass category called beneficiaries. Govern them as citizens with different routes into dignity. And here is the hard line. If the state celebrates 26.5 million beneficiaries without matching that number with an equally serious work, enterprise and mobility strategy, then the state is not defeating poverty. It is managing poverty. It is administering poverty. It is paying poverty monthly. That is not enough. Yes, pay the grants. Pay them properly. Protect the vulnerable. Stop fraud. Improve dignity. Reduce queues. Make the system humane. But do not pretend that a paid grant is a solved life. Do not pretend that a household surviving this month is the same as a household building the next decade. Do not pretend that redistribution can permanently substitute for production. Do not pretend that the social wage can carry forever what the labour market refuses to carry. The Kopje Journal and Review considers this audit incomplete if it stops at whether grants are good or bad. That is not the real question. The real question is whether grants are being connected to mobility, work, enterprise, household assets, and long-term independence. A grant can keep a household alive, but government must build the economy that gives that household a way out. That is the direct message. Yes to grants, but no to sleeping peacefully, while unemployment remains a national emergency. Chapter 10. The safety net has become the floor. So is South Africa becoming a grant economy? The answer must be precise. Not because grants exist. Modern states pay social support. The United States pays food stamps. Britain, Canada, and European countries carry different forms of social protection. So the issue is not the existence of grants. The issue is scale, dependency, and substitution. South Africa becomes a grant economy when the grant stops being temporary social protection and becomes a permanent substitute for missing wages. It becomes a grant economy when the old age grant becomes the household income spine. It becomes a grant economy when working-age adults remain outside the labour market for years. It becomes a grant economy when the child support grant supports consumption, but the child grows up into the same unemployment structure. It becomes a grant economy when social relief of distress becomes a long-term labour market pressure valve. It becomes a grant economy when poor communities receive cash but do not gain productive ownership. It becomes a grant economy when the state can distribute money more reliably than the economy can create work. The grant system is necessary, but necessity is not success. Society should be judged not only by how many people it can support through grants. It should be judged by how many people it can move from survival into security, from security into work, and from work into assets. That is the real development test. The grant is not the enemy. The grant recipient is not the enemy. The real adversary is the structure that keeps millions outside work, weakens mobility, breaks local production, and leaves the state paying monthly for a labour market failure. The real adversary is mass unemployment, weak mobility, broken local production, spatial exclusion, municipal failure, and a labour market that tells millions of people to wait outside the gate. The real adversary is a political culture that treats survival as enough. Survival is not enough. A child must eat, but the child must also inherit a working country. A pensioner must be protected, but the pensioner must not become the household. Is permanent wage system. An unemployed young person may need relief, but relief must not become the only relationship between that young person and the state. A disabled person must receive support, but support must be matched with inclusion, access, and dignity. A caregiver must be helped, but caregiving must not keep women outside the economy forever. Yes, South Africa needs grants. No, South Africa cannot build its future on grants. The safety net must remain, but the operating model must change, because a safety net catches people when they fall. A mobility platform helps people climb. South Africa has built a large safety net. Now it must build the ladders. So the viewer should leave with 3 questions. First, is the grant protecting vulnerability or substituting for missing wages? Second, does the household have any ladder from support into income, training, enterprise, or assets? Third, is the state building mobility around the recipient or only administering survival? Those are the questions that matter. Until those questions are answered, the 26.5 million beneficiary number will remain more than a welfare statistic. It will remain a national warning. It will say that the state is carrying household survival because the economy is not carrying household mobility. It will say that the grant is doing work the labour market should be doing. It will say that the country has made poverty payable, but not yet escapable, and that is the audit. A grant can keep a household alive. It cannot replace an economy that creates work. Thank you for watching. Now tell me, what are your thoughts on this important topic? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. I read all comments. If you found this analysis useful, please like this video and subscribe. The Kopje Journal and Review covers forensic analysis on Zimbabwe, South Africa, and the wider African region. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what is coming. This is the Kopje Journal and Review forensic analysis for the African perspective.